Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here with three of my colleagues to present our latest World Trade Report and to discuss it with you. The report has been prepared under the responsibility of Deputy Director General Xiaojun Yi and of our Director Bob Koopman. It's been coordinated by myself and my colleague José Antonio Monteiro, and its main authors are my colleagues who are sitting on this podium, Roberta, Cosimo, Robert, plus another few, John Hancock, Mark Coolen, Victor Kumritz, José Antonio Monteiro, and Stella Rubinova. It has benefited, the work on the report has benefited from inputs and comments from a whole range of other colleagues inside and outside of the WTO. Let me start by saying a few words about the context in which this report has been prepared. In the late or the second half of 2016 and the early 2017, trade has come under increasing fire in some developed countries. Mixed or negative views about particular trade agreements and trading relationships have been expressed in various ways, through votes, through elections, or through or simply in surveys in newspapers. Let me just mention here that this indeed is largely or is probably different in developed and developing countries. Attitudes in developing countries seem to be more favorable to trade based on surveys. This reaction to trade, and I want to mention it at the outset, is part of a reaction to globalization, which also encompasses a number of other things, in particular technological change, migration, finance, and to some extent, I think many people see trade really as the scapegoat here. And in fact, what many people seem to believe is that the current system somehow is not working for them. And indeed, if you look at some of the evidence, you see that while sort of many are doing well, some are being indeed left behind. Within country income inequality is rising in a number of economies, mostly developed, but also developing. In some countries, whole regions are being left behind. In this context, the WTO looks at trade and technology and examines how they are affecting labor markets. It argues that trade and technological progress are the most important drivers of economic advances, that overall they raise incomes and contribute to prosperity, but that inevitably these advances are accompanied by economic change and upheaval in job markets. But the main message, I think, is a positive one, is that there should be no trade-off between openness or technology and inclusiveness, and that they go together, and that the challenge is really to achieve more of all three. I'll say a few words about the first chapter, and then my colleagues will talk about the other chapters of the report. This first chapter, chapter B, is actually there to put the discussion into perspective. We realized after some work on the report that it would be maybe misleading to immediately start and discuss and focus on the effects of trade and technology without having explained how the labor market works and what determines outcomes, labor market outcomes. So chapter B is basically in two parts. The first part looks at major trends on the labor market, and I'll give you a taste of what we present in the report. And the second part discusses what labor economics can tell us about the main forces driving labor market outcomes. There are essentially two main findings in this chapter, two main messages, I'd say. The first is that the major relevant trends on the labor market are not at the aggregate level, that where the action really is at a disaggregated level. And the second is that major outcomes are largely determined by how the labor market works and sort of country-specific factors. I'll come back to this. So to give you a taste of this discussion of the trends that we have in the report, let me first just present this chart, which is about unemployment rates and which shows basically that unemployment rates do not exhibit any long-term trends. It's not that you can see that somehow at some point you have a change and an increase, an increase in unemployment or decrease in employment that you could be worried about. The incidence of unemployment varies greatly across and within regions, which goes in the direction of suggesting that there are many country-specific and region-specific factors. The second chart shows that same thing with average real wages. They have continued to rise, albeit at a slower pace since the Great Recession. And this is the case across most countries over the past 10 years. You see that it's been decreasing in emerging economies, but it's still positive. And if you look at G20 countries, you see that there's no really strong trend on in the evolution of and the growth rates of average real wages. Where the action really is taking place is as I said, at a more disaggregated level. And the report actually focuses on two sort of trends in particular. One is the trend in the change in the share of employment by sector, and the other one is the share of employment by skill level. So this chart is sort of very aggregated, and it basically shows you the evolution of the share of employment in the three main sectors. You see that the share of employment in services is increasing, and it's a long-term trend, which started already back in the 70s. It's very steady. You see that the share of employment in agriculture is steadily decreasing. And with regard to industry, you don't see much actually happening, but in reality, what is behind this sort of very aggregated chart is a differentiated evolution. In some countries, in the US, for instance, the share of employment in manufacturing has been steadily decreasing since the 70s. In other countries, it's not been decreasing to the same extent, and in a number of developing countries, it's still increasing. The share of middle-skilled occupations in total employment has declined in developed economies. We call this polarization. Basically, what you see on this chart is that the share of high-skilled occupations has been increasing in most countries in the world. You see, because this is a sample of developing and developed countries, the little crosses or the little what do you call that? X's are all above the zero line. You see that when it comes to middle-skilled occupations, the little triangles, a lot of them are underneath the zero line. And if you look at low-skilled occupations, it depends a little bit. In many cases, it's above. In other cases, it's below. So it reflects the fact that this polarization is something that you observe in most developed countries and a number of developing, but definitely not in all developing countries. The skill premium is sort of the added facet of this employment and wages by skills. You see that we see here on this graph that basically the skill premium has indeed been increasing in a number of countries, but it has also been decreasing in a group of other countries. Latin American countries, for instance, are clearly, or Latin America is clearly a region where the skill premium has been decreasing. And while India and China clearly have a relatively strong increasing trend. It's important to keep this in the back of your minds when we will be discussing the effect of trade and technological change, for that matter, on the demand for skills. Just 2 more slides on this first chapter. The first is just to say that country-specific, that one of the main findings of this sort of review of the labor economics literature is that country-specific factors play an important role in explaining labor market outcomes. And the sort of country-specific factors we're talking about here are macroeconomic conditions, labor market institutions, and mobility frictions. The other, I think, main takeaway message of this second half of the first chapter is concerns adjustment costs, and which is a very important concept in this report. And the adjustment process is really something we've been focusing a lot of attention on in this report. What is adjustment? Essentially, what we see is that workers who lose their jobs in declining sector, be it because of technology or trade, in declining sectors or in exposed regions, are not always well equipped and well placed to access newly created jobs. And this is sort of because of various frictions which prevent them from actually simply moving without frictionlessly or easily from one job to the next. These frictions, which are of different types, we identify and discuss several in the report: skill mismatches, geographic mobility frictions, institutions-related frictions. All those frictions actually prevent adjustment from happening smoothly. We say a few things about this process of adjustment. Maybe one important message is that what we find is what the empirical literature finds is that on average obstacles to labor mobility are about twice as high in developing countries as in developed countries. So let me now give the floor to my colleague Cosimo, who will talk about the effect of technological change on labor markets. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. So I will start with the aggregate effects of technology on labor markets before moving to the compositional effects on workers depending on their skills and the tasks they perform. So we start the chapter by claiming that technological progress is the main source of economic growth, as shown in a lot of the growth literature, but at the same time is also the main source of labor market change. In particular, new technologies can substitute for workers. So there is this labor substitution effect of technology, which is, however, compensated by several mechanisms that are detailed in the report. And therefore, even at a theoretical level, the effect of technology on labor demand is ambiguous. So it is an empirical question. And what has the literature found? It has found small and possibly even positive effects of technological change on aggregate labor demand and employment. This is a general message of the literature, but not all papers in the literature find the same. Some studies that are detailed in the report show negative effects on labor demand, on aggregate labor demand, generated by technological change. What is true is that in all sorts of countries, being then developed or developing, the most relevant effects, rather than on the overall level of employment, are on the structure of employment. And this is what most of the section is focused on. So the first thing to consider when we look at the structure of employment is the so-called skill bias technical change. The fact that technological progress has contributed to higher relative demand for skilled workers. In particular, the rapid diffusion of information and communication technologies, ICTs, in the 1980s is responsible for an increase in the relative demand for skills, because skills and these types of technology are highly complementary. At the same time, this development the response of labor supply is endogenous, in the sense that the development of skill complementarity technologies was partly driven by the fact that there was a large increase in the supply of skilled workers since the 1960s. At the empirical level, there is ample confirmation of the skill bias technical change hypothesis, both for developed countries and also for developing countries. So in the case of developed country evidence, we have looked at studies that look at technology in the form of use of computers, R&D intensity, the number of innovations and patents, and the general message is that all these measures of technology correlate positively with the employment of skilled labor. In particular, it has been the use of computers in the workplace that has been mostly responsible for changes in the skill premium. So the quantitative literature has estimated that in the United States, computerization accounts for approximately 60% of the rise in the skill premium between 1984 and 2003. As I was saying, the same sort of evidence is also there for developing countries, especially when you look at the type of technological change that is embodied in imports or in inward FDI. The second part of this section is dedicated to the routine bias technical change, to the fact that technological change is correlated with employment polarization. Why is that so? Because technological change mostly and disproportionately affects routine activities, be them cognitive or manual, more than non-routine activities. And the routine activities are the ones that are typically performed by middle-skilled workers. And so there is evidence that technological change decreases the demand for middle-skilled workers and increases the relative demand for low skills and high-skilled workers. And with a few relevant exceptions, this is the message coming from the empirical literature. There is actually one paper that focuses on robotization, robot density, and shows that industrial robots lead to skill upgrading rather than to employment polarization. And we are working on, we are doing empirical work because there is a need for it in this area. Quantification comes for a paper showing that technological shocks in the US, measured as shocks in ICT capital, explain 1/3 of the observed decline in middle-skilled employment, while in developing countries, there's very limited evidence of routine bias technical change. We only have evidence for 2 Latin American countries, Chile and Colombia. Now, the third part of the section is dedicated to the future of work. An important part of that subsection is itself dedicated to those studies that try to quantify the amount of jobs that might be at risk from automation and computerization. And what we document in the section is that those predictions vary very widely. So one dimension along which these predictions vary is how you adjust technological change by its feasibility. So as you can see in this graph, whether you consider technological change adjusted or non-adjusted by feasibility, you can have different messages. So in particular, the little triangles here might suggest that the share of jobs at risk of automation is higher in high-income countries than in low-income countries. But this is adjusting for technological feasibility. And I'm sorry, so these are the squares, the dark blue squares. While if you don't adjust for technological feasibility, you might get the opposite message. That is, the share of jobs at risk of automation decreases with the income of the country. And another dimension that really matters is the level of disaggregation that is used. In particular, studies that look at occupation level approach estimate a much higher share of occupations at risk of automation than studies that look at jobs, just because we perform different occupations in a given job. So if you consider a worker being an occupation, this worker might be more at risk of automation than if you consider a worker as a bundle of different occupations. And we conclude saying that automation does not necessarily equate with future unemployment, because there are a lot of constraints, including, as I was saying before, affordability, feasibility of technology, but also regulatory frameworks and public acceptance of new technology that will shape the relationship between automation and jobs. What is clear is that future automation will be disruptive for workers whose skills become obsolete, as it has been in the past, and who face the risk of job losses and having to switch tasks and jobs because there are switching costs, as my colleague Marc was describing before. This concludes the chapter.
So then we move analyzing what do we know about what the impact of trade is on the labor market, and given the role that the debate and the sort of the share of the guilt of the negative effects on labor markets of either technology and trade have, what we try to do first is to look first at the big picture and what do we know about the big pictures of the effect of trade and technology. We know for trade that, like technology, trade produces great gains. Trade produces gains through lower prices. These also reflect in higher real wages, so more consumption possibility for consumers, and also increases productivity. Through trade, we can import at cheaper price, high quality intermediate inputs, and produce more. This is quite an undisputed fact that we need to keep in the back of our mind. So when we start looking at the impact of labor markets, we do not mean to look at the overall impact of trade on welfare. And we are looking, there's quite sort of an undisputed, it is quite undisputed that trade produces overall gains. So the question now becomes, okay, so what we're talking now is what is the impact on the labor market? And also when you look at the labor market, one thing to think of is, first, let's try to assess what is the impact of trade on the figure that we all care about, overall level of employment and average wages. And when we look at this level of aggregation, we actually do not find the negative effect of trade on unemployment. Actually, when you look at the aggregate level, even if only marginally, we have evidence of marginally positive effect on trade on unemployment. Just if you look at some figures, we do know that importers and exporters pay higher wages. It's about 30% more than firms that only focus on domestic markets. When we look at the number of jobs related to trading and export related, so when we account jobs in firms that export and firms that produce for exporting firms, in some countries up to 30% of employment is trade related. And there's also another other share for which we do not have estimations, that is job related to imports. Okay? And this is very high to quantify. These are not only people who are in the trading activity, but also people that work thanks to the fact that cheaper import allows our firms to be competitive in the international market. Okay, we tried. It's very hard to actually get figures for this that could not be attacked on several grounds. So what is the first, I think, important fact to clarify is that when we talk about the negative effect of trade on the labor market, we are not talking about overall employment. We are not talking about average wages. What people talk about is the effect of import competition on job losses in some regions, some cities, or some sectors. Okay, I apologize. I created a link, but I need to go and show it here. And this actually shows that if you start looking at the relationship between how open countries are and how much is the level of unemployment, you actually can't see any form of relationship. This is, if you try even a simple correlation, you don't get a correlation. And these findings are supported by studies and econometric studies that show that this is indeed the case. So the story about the effect and the worries or the impact of import competition on the labor market is a story of composition of employment, and it's not a story of the level of employment. And like technology, trade does trigger change, and this is something that we have always known since at least Akshay, that one of the ways in which trade creates benefits and brings gains is just because it's reallocate resources from a sector where a country has a comparative disadvantage to a sector where a country has a comparative advantage. Thanks to specialization, a country export and grow. So what is new now is that what has happened most recently is that we have a big change in trade, a large change of trade. There were studies on estimates on the amount of adjustment costs, but economists tend to believe that these adjustment costs were small and negligible. Okay, there are not such huge changes of in the trade flows as what happened more recently with the growth of the emerging economies. And another element that economists have disregarded in part in their estimation of adjustment costs is that industries tend to be concentrated in some regions, and people do not move easily from one region to another one. And so when import competition hits a certain sector, it does hit a community, and people in that community lose their job, and that creates big visible costs. There are other people in other communities and in other regions or in other sectors gaining out of this redistribution and getting a job, because if there is not overall effect, but they're not the same people, and we need to take this into account. And indeed, when you look at the recent evidence on the impact of China's import competition in the US market, there is evidence that in regions less exposed to import competition, employment developed more favorably, okay, than in regions where more exposed to import competition. But these studies only look at the manufacturing sector and the effect on a certain local market. And studies that have enlarged this analysis and looked at what happens if we take into account that you may lose a job in the manufacturing sector and get a job in the services sector, even in the same region. What happens in that case? You do not get a negative effect. And what happens if you take into account that firms are located in different geographic regions, and somebody may lose a job in a plant in a certain region, but then gain it in a plant, and somebody else gains it in a plant in another region. So when you look at this dynamic, also for the US and import competition from China, you do get that overall there is not a negative impact of import competition on employment. And also, the second fact that we can assess that even if you just look at the negative input of import competition in a certain local market in manufacturing, what economists managed to identify as the impact of trade is about 20-25% of the US decline in manufacturing. thus leaving a share of 75–80% of the effect actually of the job in manufacturing, of the loss in manufacturing jobs due to other factors such as technological change. The second important composition effect is not just a change of jobs across regions and sectors, but a change in the relative demand for skills versus unskilled jobs. So what has happened then, both in developing and in developed countries, is the demand for skills has increased. Trade has indeed, has actually led to an increase in the demand for skilled workers. And in developed countries, this is the effect of forces, simple forces of specialization, known, but also the fact that offshoring through global supply chains has led to a replacement some offshoreable jobs, like routine types of jobs, in developed countries with and have concentrated in more higher skill tasks and also higher innovation. In developing countries, what has happened is technological diffusion, the use of intermediate inputs of a better quality that has required more skilled workers to work in a factory also in developing countries. So what does this mean? This means that if you demand more skills and you have a higher demand for high qualified workers, you have more high qualified workers will be employed and the wage for high qualified workers will increase. And this increases the gap, the skill premium, between the wage of the high skill and the wage of the low skill job. And at the same time increases the share of skilled workers in employment. But another important element to keep in mind is that an increase in skill premium, it does affect wage inequality, but wage inequality is not income inequality. Wage inequality is a part, or it's useful for the consumer. What is important for our welfare is the income, our ability to use a certain amount of money to buy things. And when you take this into account, and studies that look at the impact of trade on income inequality do not find a strong effect. Actually, we have last year in the essay Award, a paper that actually proves that income inequality goes down. Why? Because trade liberalization actually decreases the price of goods that are consumed by the poorest, so those with lower wages, the most, and these act as a factor to reduce income inequality. So this concludes the section, and then the report looks at what government can do to actually respond to these challenges.
So I will focus primarily on domestic actions or measures that could be taken to facilitate adjustment in an economy that's responding to economic change, whatever the source of that change is, whether it's technology or trade. Now, before I go on and describe these actions or measures, it might be useful to explain why you need government action in this particular area. Because certainly you can ask the question, why don't you just let the markets function and let it affect this adjustment to economic change? And the reason has to do with the focus of our report, which is on how workers are able to adjust to economic change. And how that process carries on depends a lot on how well the labor market is functioning to match workers and firms to one another. And as we know from both the labor economics literature as well as the macroeconomic literature, is in general, the labor market does a poor job of matching workers and firms to one another. in the labor economics, in Marc's presentation, he referred to these problems as frictions. In the macro literature, it's usually called rigidity or inflexibility of the labor market. And you can see in the way governments react to changes in aggregate employment. They automatically resort to monetary policy and to fiscal policy to respond to big changes in employment. And that's the same reason why adjustment policies are necessary to try and help the economy and workers in particular to adjust to economic change. Now, the report talks about a package of measures of policies, what we have described in the report as adjustment, competitiveness, and compensation policies to help workers manage the cost of adjustment, as well as to maximize the opportunities of the economy to take advantage of the benefits from either technology or from trade. Now, let me try and describe and differentiate each of those policies. So by adjustment policies, we refer to measures taken to lower the cost of job search or of matching workers to jobs. And so these are measures that are targeted primarily at the labor market, trying to help it function more effectively. Competitiveness policies refer to policies that are not specifically targeted at the labor market, so they may be targeted at the education or health markets, but which allow the economy to take better advantage of the trade or technological opportunities from these forces. And lastly, compensation policies are policies that are that try to effect redistribution across winners and losers. And it reflects the recognition that sometimes technological change and trade can leave some people worse off, and there's no way from their own activities and from adjustment or competitive policies to bring them back to where they were before. Now, I would like to maybe also talk a little, try to distinguish adjustment policies into two different ways. Adjustment policies can be general in nature or can be specific. So general adjustment policies are those that help workers no matter what the source of the disturbance or shock was. So whether it's technological change or trade, these measures, these programs kick in. Specific programs, on the other hand, specific adjustment programs are those that respond to specific sources of shocks. And one of, obviously, the more well-known are trade adjustment programs. Now, adjustment policies targeted at the labor market can also be distinguished whether they are active labor market policies or policies that are passive. And one way to distinguish between the two is that active labor markets try to help workers find jobs. Workers who are displaced from current jobs find alternative employment prospects. So these involve actions such as job training or job search assistance. And then passive labor market policies include policies that provide income supplements to workers who lose their jobs, such as unemployment insurance. Now, another way to cut this cake is to say, well, compensation policies are addressed at equity or fairness issues, that you want to make sure that those who lose out from technological or changes from trade are compensated for those losses. So it's a fairness objective or criterion that's operating. Whereas adjustment and competitiveness policies are trying to make the economy more efficient, whether it's the labor market or other markets. So if you apply that kind of lens, active labor market policies, one can characterize this as targeting or being concerned with labor market efficiency, while passive labor market policies are much more targeted at ensuring that losers are compensated. That's one way of looking at it. But I argue that even unemployment insurance are a means for making labor markets more efficient. And the way to look at that is to make the following argument, sometimes it makes sense economically for more workers to take on risky jobs because the potential payoffs from taking on those risky jobs are much higher. For example, working in a high-tech startup. I think it's bad for the economy in general. Every one of us works in safe but dead-end jobs, like, I guess, being an international civil servant, or worse, maybe a diplomat. So you want to encourage more risk-taking by workers, and the way you do that is providing this unemployment insurance. It acts as a kind of social safety net that they know they can rely on if they lose their job in this potentially higher productivity sort of jobs. Now, let me turn to some examples of adjustment programs that we examine in this report. So we look at the U.S. Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, the European Globalization Adjustment Program, the Danish Flex Security Model, although it might actually be a disservice to characterize this model as an adjustment program, and also some programs in developing countries like in Korea and in Mexico. Now, we reviewed the literature that have examined the effectiveness of these various adjustment programs, and we can more or less summarize the assessment of those programs into maybe 4 major points. So the first point is that it appears from the studies of these programs that general programs tend to function more effectively than specific programs. For if you look at certain metrics, for example, they tend to get higher reemployment rates, and the wages that the workers who transition to new jobs appear to be higher in programs, in more general programs. Second, there's an argument to be made for additional funding for specific programs. For example, the European Globalization Fund has a budget of about $154 million in 2014. The modest amount of resources allocated to some of these specific adjustment programs is such that many workers don't even know that these programs exist. A third result from those studies, programs tailored to worker and country specifications appear to function better. So that's the assessment of the European Globalization Fund. So if it's synchronized with national priorities, it seems to function much better. And certainly the Danish Flex Security model, I mean, there's a strong association with the success of that model with certain notions about how Nordic society is constructed, that there's an emphasis on achieving fairness and also on a feeling of trust in those societies. And finally, a final point on the active labor market policy. So in general, I think there's an assessment that these programs, active labor market policies, work best, although that's not universally shared. But even those who are skeptical of the effectiveness of active labor market policies, I think agree that certain elements of those measures or of those programs tend to work well. So job search assistance and retraining. If you look at how effectively those programs improve the efficiency of matching firms and workers together, those types of elements of active labor market policies seem to function very well. One last thing before I move on to this slide. We also looked at the developing country experience with adjustment. And we reached a number of conclusions about those programs. One, certainly the case that they are, the resources to fund them are quite difficult to find in developing countries. Second, there's a larger share of workers in the agriculture, informal, and state-owned enterprises in developing countries. So adjustment programs tend to reflect this preponderance of workers in those sectors, as you can see from, for example, the Mexican program on farm workers. And I think the third point I need to make is that given this large share of workers in those sectors in developing countries, the informal sector actually functions as a way of buffering job losses in the formal sector. So those are things that you need to take into account if you want to know more about what's happening in developing countries. Now, let me then turn to the second and third pillar of the mix of adjustment policies that help workers adjust to economic change. So the competitiveness policies we look at in the report include infrastructure, credit market, and education policies, and we also look at trade policies. And let me just focus on those two. So my colleagues Cosimo and Roberta talked about how both trade and technological change tend to increase the demand for skilled workers. Well, that calls for, certainly for more investment in education to make sure that your economies have enough supply of these skilled workers to adjust to those types of increased demand. And then trade policy also has a role to increase the competitiveness of an economy. Obviously, if you negotiate more market access opportunities from your trade partners, that's one way of allowing your export sector to expand and absorb some of the workers who might be moving from the contracting sectors. A second way in which trade policy can help the economy become more competitive and absorb additional workers is by reducing import barriers. So if your economy is one that's integrated to global value chains, we know that the cheaper the intermediate inputs that those firms in global value chains absorb, the more competitive they are, the more export opportunities they can take advantage of. And in general, reducing trade costs would be the most effective way of increasing competitiveness, such as implementing the trade facilitation agreement. The World Trade Report that we did 2 years ago estimated that full implementation of the TFA can reduce trade costs by as much as 15%, something that the OECD, I think, will also refer to later on. And then, insofar as compensation policies are concerned, the report looks at the rationale for compensation policies. If there are permanent losers from either trade or technological change, what would be the rationale for providing some form of compensation to the losers? But the report doesn't go and examine what mechanisms or what instruments, policy instruments, are the best ways of effecting this redistribution, if that is where the society wants to go. And finally, the report also looks at this question of whether increased openness, the globalized nature of many economies hamper governments' abilities to effect redistribution. And it finds that there's no evidence that it ties governments' hands if they want to compensate losers from economic change. As I said, I have focused on domestic measures, and maybe Marc, in his concluding comments, might want to say more about the role of the WTO and international cooperation in general. Sorry for putting you on the spot.
Well, actually, time is passing. I think we may actually come back to this issue afterwards. What I want to do now is really give the floor to Julia Nielson, who is here to actually discuss the report. And before opening the discussion to the whole room, I think it's going to be a very interesting perspective. She's been working for many years on this in this area and on those issues, and I'm sure her comments will be extremely interesting and stimulating.
Thank you, Marc, and thank you very much for having me here today. I hope I will be interesting, because I'm going to start with something boring, which is I actually agree with pretty much everything that's in this report. So there may be a couple of things that we'll pick up, but in particular, I guess I'd like to highlight that this report makes an incredibly important contribution by doing something deeply unfashionable at the moment, which is facts and evidence, in a very clear and very thorough and very helpful way. I'd like to touch on sort of 4 areas quickly in making some comments. The first is it technology or is it trade? The second is technology different this time? Is this time different? The third is a few words about trade. And lastly, to focus a bit more on what can we do about it. On the is it technology or trade, I think the report does an excellent job of going through the evidence on this. And it's true that we see that, most studies will show that that the impact on job losses, especially in developed countries, and a lot of what I'll say is focused on developed countries, partially because that's the organisation where I now work, but also because a lot of the locus of concern about job losses has been in the developed countries, with some quite strong implications for global trade politics. Most studies will find a maximum of about 20 to 35% is attributable to trade, and it depends a little bit on how you measure technology. But I think the key point that the report makes very strongly is that these are mutually interdependent with trade and technology. Technology has fundamentally changed how we trade, from containerization through to digital trade. In the same way, we often say that one of the great things about trade is that it's so effective in disseminating and spurring technological innovation. So in a sense, you kind of have to address the two together. And even from a policy sense, if you were trying to think about the solution, even if we said, look, it's all technology, if you wanted to stop technology or do something about technology, for most countries that would mean stopping trade. So in a sense, we end up, if we're trying to solve the problem, in the same place. But I guess the real question is technology somehow different this time? Is what we're seeing something that we haven't seen before, something that is going to really pose unprecedented challenges? And here I think the report does an excellent job again about sort of setting out the yes and the no case, which amongst my colleagues, especially those working on a large project we have on digitalisation and going digital, who were the sort of techno-optimists of the OECD versus the other parts of the House. I mean, on the sort of no camp is the sense of, look, Ned Ludd couldn't see the other jobs coming either when they smashed up the looms. That, we've been here before. History says that old jobs go, but new jobs come. That the productivity effects, the productivity gains will lead to increased demand in other areas. And that in many areas, as the report points out, technology is complementary to labour rather than a substitute to it. But on the other side, we're seeing some different kinds of effects this time. For a start, we're seeing a pace that is faster. We're seeing a pervasiveness and something that goes global pretty much instantly rather than in a staggered phase. And it's happening against the background of already some interesting demographics and challenges. The kind of work that we've done highlights probably about 9% of jobs being across the OECD area in any event, being at serious risk of automation. But more importantly, for another 25% of jobs, about half the tasks involved in those jobs are going to change. So even though the jobs are still there, they're different jobs. And often, as has been pointed out, they're higher skilled jobs. They're not catering for the same kinds of workers. Moreover, we're no longer just talking about manufacturing. We're now seeing the real changes coming into services, into retail, into areas we hadn't thought of perhaps that are less obvious, such as food and beverage. Interestingly, actually, while there's sort of good and bad news in that the job losses are heavily concentrated in male-dominated sectors of employment, but much more so than for female-dominated sectors. But that said, women tend to lack in technical skills. There seems to be a lag there, which means that probably in some ways they have a different challenge in taking advantage of the opportunities. But essentially, there's two other factors that might make things complicated compared to, say, big technological shifts in past centuries. One is that we now have social safety nets. That's good news, but they also need to be paid for and they need to be funded. And they've been built in many cases on a funding model where people have regular jobs and they pay into them. And I'll come back to that later. And the other is that we have universal suffrage and representative democracy, which means that anger, frustration, dislocation can be reflected back into a political system much faster. Again, good news, but it also means that in this fast-changing world, a 10-year adjustment period where some people may have trouble adapting is a very, very long time. I'll say a couple of quick words about trade. I won't come to the WTO to tell my colleagues about trade. But just to highlight that I think the report makes a very important point that imports are important for jobs, not just exports, and that you need to look at the whole picture of how somebody is affected by trade. I wish that we could get at the entire consumption basket of goods and services for any given individual to see whether in the net somebody is actually a winner or a loser for trade. But the point that was also made by Roberta about income versus wage inequality is also important. The evidence we have suggests that the fact that tax and benefit systems have become significantly less redistributive is a major factor feeding into income inequality. But as you also pointed out, what we know is that losses from trade are perhaps deeper than we thought. They're more concentrated than we thought, and especially in manufacturing. And manufacturing is heavily concentrated regionally in developed countries. Add to that the fact that it's happening on top of a phenomenon of lagging regions. So about 1 in 4 people at the moment across at least the OECD area lives in a region that would have to quadruple its growth rate to catch up with the rest of the country. So in these regions, you're more likely to lose your job, you're less likely to find another job, you're less likely to be able to move because you're trapped often in negative equity in housing, and you may be more dependent on the kind of services in your immediate neighbourhood which may not be available. And across the world, when I talk to my labour market colleagues, this is the people that everyone's concerned about. Within the broader world of labour market churn of people changing jobs, there's the world of displaced workers who are involuntary changing jobs. But a lot of those are young people. They're moving around. They're finding other work. Then there's a core of workers which everybody is concerned about. They tend to be older. They have trouble moving to another job. They often have quite specialist skills. They're often regionally concentrated. Quickly, though, as well, I think that the report makes a very important point about why cutting off trade isn't the answer, and why, as well, trying to protect individual jobs, keeping that factory open in that region isn't the answer. They give a very good example of the cost of protecting jobs in the US. In my own country, the government spent $2 billion a year for about 20 years protecting 40,000 jobs in the car industry, which actually changed anyway ultimately for technology. And in an interesting piece of sort of marketing and the power of communication, this protection was done in the name of Australia's national car, the General Motors Holden. Growing up, none of us kind of realised the irony of that. And that was so in a sense, even if you try to hold back trade, the technology comes in any event at the end. So what can we do about it? As has been mentioned, it's a package. I agree with everything that the report says about domestic policies and also the role. I'll come back on international policies, however. Certainly, the points that are made about policies for competition, for trade, are very important, and I can talk about trade costs later. But I think the key thing is in terms of investment. I mean, we highlight 3 things. The first is domestic policies for innovation, competition and opportunity. That means getting out of the way, trade facilitation, services liberalisation, means investment in infrastructure, but also in people. And the report does a very good job of talking about the kinds of skills that are needed, especially the softer problem-solving skills. But just to highlight here, we obviously still have some work to do, because the evidence we have suggests that of people whose jobs are at high risk of automation, about 40% have access to training or do training. The figure for those people whose jobs are at low risk of automation is 70%. So at the moment, low-skilled workers are significantly less likely to be offered and to be taking training than high-skilled workers. So we've got a mismatch there. The second area is doing more to bring everybody along. And I'll focus here just quickly on adjustment. And I'm probably going to be less polite than Robert about trade-specific adjustment programs. The evidence we have is that these are significantly less efficient. And I think there's a couple of reasons. Firstly, there's a strong equity argument that says, should I privilege somebody who's lost their job from trade to somebody who lost their job as a robot? Is there a reason why we would treat those two people differently? But one thing we know about any assistance, it's what matters most is speed, is how fast it gets it and upstream. And often trade adjustment programs tend to be slower because you have to work out eligibility. Eligibility also gives rise to some sometimes perverse effects. If you are in a factory that shuts, you get trade adjustment assistance. If you are in the sandwich shop where the workers from the factory used to buy their lunch that shuts, you don't. And there's also, I think, some interesting work to be done here about unintended gender effects. Depending on the nature of the factory, where are the women? So one of the realities, though, I think we're facing in the trade world is a much greater political pressure to have bespoke adjustment packages. If you want to get an FTA up, here is the adjustment package that I can point to show that we're taking care of this. And I think we need to be very careful about that. For the reasons of whether these work, but also because by looking after particular groups, we undermine a political coalition for stronger basic social safety nets across the board, which we know are more effective. So perhaps we need to think in the same way as aid for trade has become part of and well integrated with the broader world of development finance, but has been very effective in making a case for greater attention to trade in development finance. Maybe we need to think about social safety nets for trade in the same way. And the last point I'd like to make about that is in terms of these general social safety nets, because one of the problems we have is that these are under pressure in many parts of the world. They are under pressure already, even before we start talking about digitalisation. They are under pressure from demographics as people retire earlier and live longer, and they were somewhat under pressure from changes in the global economy. But digitalisation, as more people have different kinds of jobs or don't have the kinds of jobs that have traditionally funded safety nets, means we need to think again about how we operate and fund those. Portability of benefits, attaching benefits to individuals rather than jobs, having training accounts that attach to a person so it doesn't matter how often they change jobs, and trying to find ways to bring gig economy workers under the kinds of protections or benefits such as maternity benefits that other workers get. And lastly, I think there's still a lot to know there. When we look at something that looks very good, like unemployment insurance, when I talk to my Labour colleagues and I say, this sounds like a great idea, why isn't there more of it? And nobody quite knows. So clearly we still have some areas where we could be doing more. I'll finish with one last point, which is just about the importance as well of not just domestic policies to handle the international economy, but also international cooperation. The report does a very good job of outlining where labour is in trade agreements. But trade agreements and trade doesn't have to do everything. I think we also have a broader international architecture. We have the ILO. We have mechanisms on ways of taking forward that cooperation and training. And I can say more about that if people are interested in questions and answers. But I think the report does a very important job in doing one of the things that we really need to do in this space, which is to start a much more open conversation, and a conversation based on evidence, based on experience, and based on a thoughtful approach. So thank you.
Many thanks, Julia. I think I will immediately now open the floor to all of you, and I hope we can have a discussion, which was the objective of this session. So please, yes, Henning. I'll just maybe identify 2 or 3 speakers. Hector. Okay. So let's do 3 questions, and we'll try to answer them, and then.
Many thanks, Mark, and thanks indeed for this in-depth look at this valuable report. I'm Henning Envall from the Swedish mission here in Geneva, and I have got 2 questions actually. Sorry, one for Roberta. You said that you can see that there is actually better development on the labor market in regions which has been more exposed to trade. And I was just wondering, that's an interesting finding, and I was just wondering if you could give us an example on how that actually happens, so we can visualize this. Another question for Robert on, you said that you don't find evidence that globalization has actually hindered government from, in any significant way, from adopting measures to help with adjustment and so on. And I was wondering how you reached that conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Also very interesting presentation, and Julia, very interesting discussion. I have two questions as well. One is for Roberta and the other one is for Robert, maybe Julia as well. Let me start by the last one. Robert, you made very eloquently the case that domestic policies are very important to minimize the consequences, the undesired consequences of trade liberalization. However, the point is, adjustment policies and compensation policies have fiscal costs, and Julia mentioned that you have to fund them. Okay, and implementing them at a national level could affect the competitiveness of the national economy, eventually compounding trade tensions and possibly compounding also current account imbalances. So it could backfire if it doesn't come with more policy coherence at the global level. So the emphasis on domestic policies is fine, but it is far from enough. And so the question there is, what role do you see that the WTO, and Julia may chip in with the OECD, play to promote a more policy coherence and make the domestic policies more coherent, I mean the adjustments at domestic level more coherent and sustainable, of course. And the question for Roberta is, I am very curious to know, how do you disentangle the consequences of technology from those of trade on employment? Because as you said, and Julia made the point as well, technological innovation is not endogenous in an integrated economy. How do you manage to provide these facts and evidence to say that this is about 25% the responsibility of trade and the rest is somebody else? Thank you.
Thank you as well to the panel and to Julia for the discussion. I have a question in two areas. One is the skill premium in developing countries. Roberta mentioned that it's mainly due to technological progress or productivity improvements. So my question is, the literature, does it say anything, or to what extent is the skill premium happening between or within sectors? So is it between, you have like a structural change in developing countries, or is it more that you have within our sectors more firms export and that leads to more skill demand? So any evidence on the, or more detail on the skill premium in developing countries? And then on the issue of jobs at risk, it comes, okay, technology creates new jobs, and then in the media you read often these new jobs which are created, will they be indeed be high skill, or is there a risk that many new jobs will actually be rather middle or low skill in the services industry? Maybe if you have there any view or any on this, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know where we will start. I think Robert and Robert, a number of questions that were specifically asked to them. So maybe Roberta, you can start.
Okay, thank you for giving the possibility to clarify some element of the story about the impact of trade on unemployment, local unemployment. So what these studies do, they compare the evolution of unemployment in different community zones, they are called, so specific areas. And by comparing how the different areas behave, what they actually find that areas where they're more exposed to import competition actually performed worse. So more import competition performed worse than area where less exposed to import competition. But the important element I like to sort of add to this discussion is that this study actually look at only one element of trade, right? With import competition, there's much more. There's a lot of improvement in market access when you liberalize. And on this, there is actually evidence of the opposite when you take into account improvement in market access, conditions in market access. So areas, there is evidence for Vietnam, for example, after the US-Vietnam free trade area agreement, where provinces more exposed that face a better improvement in access market condition in the US actually performed better. So there are two parts of the stories. The stories that look at import competition do find a negative impact in the regions more exposed. Those that look at market access condition find better effects in areas that have a better improvement in market access, conditions of market access. So import competition is also just part of the story. So these studies actually look at one specific channel in competition in specific communities without looking at how jobs are reallocated across regions and sectors. But thank you for giving me the opportunity to specify this. In terms of how to disentangle trade and technology, where do the number 20-25% come from? So the crucial element here is what has been identified as attributable to trade. So these studies that's identified the specific channel, identified, yes, what is due to import competition. So identify the effect of this specific channel, then there can be an impact of trade on unemployment that somehow interact for technology. Okay, this is still in this residual. This is unidentified, an effect that is unidentified. So what is the 20-25% is what these studies managed to identify, but there can be an impact of trade that remain in the unidentified part, the 75-80%, that there is a residual. For Rainer, for the question on the skill premium in developing countries, for what I recall, the studies find an increase in the wage gap of skilled versus unskilled. I don't recall studies that look at the composition, sectoral composition. And yes, the argument it tends to be the fact that exporting is a skill-intensive activity per se. You need to know about standards, you need to know about conditions in other markets, and so on. So, but I don't recall studies that look at the composition effect, but this I can be corrected.
Robert?
On the first question about the impact of openness or globalization on the capacity of governments to take redistributive measures, there's a literature that has looked at that particular topic. And usually what they look at are two things. One is some index of openness of an economy, and second is the size of the social transfers of the government budget. And although there's a debate, there's no firm conclusion of the impact of openness on the size of social transfers that governments effect. And I guess the best example of that would be countries like Sweden, where it's highly open and the social element of the budget is quite large, the amount of transfers. So you have those kind of examples that illustrate the fact that the evidence does not show that greater openness or globalization in general have constrained the ability of governments to take redistributive measures. On Hector's question, that's a difficult one. Maybe let's, and this is brainstorming, let me try to answer you this way. Obviously, if the amount of expenditures that government allocates for adjustment programs result in that government taking an action that this directly impinges a particular WTO agreement. For example, it takes an anti-dumping action or some safeguard action because, let's say, currency depreciation or appreciation impacts the competitiveness of one sector, then you have existing WTO rules that will operate. If it's not clear whether existing WTO rules apply, then maybe it's a subject for conversation or discussion within a TPR framework or some other sort of soft law kind of discussion. So I guess maybe the best advice there is to be transparent about what you're doing and why you're doing that, in the hope that your trade partners understand the context in which these actions are being taken. So I mean that's the best I can do at the moment. I'm sure others will have better ideas about how best to address that issue.
Maybe on this particular point, I think Julia can.
Thanks, and thanks for the interesting questions and the challenging question, Hector. I mean, thinking of the social safety net point, absolutely, you're right. But these are, this is first and foremost an investment in your own people, not just the society you want now, but the society you want in the future, especially if we know the future is going to be about skills. So I think, when every country approaches the issue of the social safety net, I think they see it in terms of an investment. And probably I worked in the World Bank during the global economic crisis, and one of the things that was most striking was the early response, especially for countries who had lived through the Asian financial crisis, who recognised that the cost of not protecting during a massive downturn was potentially a lost generation, both as kids left school and were pulled out of school and had breaks in their education that lasted for a long time, but especially when it was coupled with the food price crisis. The effects of malnutrition are tragic and lifelong. So the lesson for a lot of countries was you need to put the pipes in for social safety nets. This is not a luxury. This is a basic expenditure. And in fact, that was the area of lending in the bank that grew fastest and most in the crisis was social protection, social safety net. But the other interesting thing about it is, of course, there are ways and ways to do this. And here the developing world is way ahead of the developed world in many cases, partially because the developed world has a lot of legacy issues of old, expensive, inefficient, poorly targeted systems in many cases. And some of the most efficient and good experiments are coming out of, relatively cost-effective in fiscal terms social safety nets are in the developing world. But you're also right that this doesn't happen in isolation, that the domestic policies are one part of the picture, but ensuring it happens within the context of that sort of the rest of the rules of the road of international economic cooperation. So we do see now a huge emphasis on international tax cooperation, for example, to exactly, countries are concerned about getting their fiscal bases back precisely to be able to afford those kind of investments. And I think also that's part of some of the focus in trade rules on what's a level playing field in international trade and what are the kinds of expenditures and what are the kinds of policies that people think are fair and contributing to that. A quick word on the new jobs. If anything, it seems that the low-skilled jobs, especially those that require personal presence, ageing populations, personal care, childcare, aged care, are kind of growing. The World Bank just did quite an interesting report called Trouble in the Making about manufacturing and looking, especially in developing countries, at what the possible impacts would be, including for these large-scale GVC, low-skill assembly jobs. I guess the answer is nobody knows yet, and that's the big question. I mean, somebody on one hand will have to fix the robots, but whether they will be enough low-skilled jobs or whether those jobs will still be good jobs is a different question. But I think, as the report says, a lot of that is going to be in the hands of policy.
Okay, I think we have time maybe for one more question. If someone has a burning question, I'll take it. Well, it doesn't need to be burning. I mean, okay, go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentations. I'm trying to link different aspects of what was said, and including the reference to taxation, and I guess the work that the OECD has also done to try to bring some coherence here at the international level, and linking this to the question of technological change. And I'm not clear whether in your work in the World Trade Report you are taking technological change as an exogenous variable or something that could come under the influence of policymakers. And I'm looking at Wolf now here and thinking about the TRIPS and thinking about taxation of companies like Google, like Apple, and how they seem to pay a lot less taxes than the traditional producers of goods, agriculture, manufacturing in particular, and whether in fact we have set up unintentionally a system that is encouraging a pace of technological change that is perhaps above what more, how you say, undistorted market would produce. That's my question.
So the short answer to your question is that we largely take technological changes exogenous, not because we believe it is exogenous. We know of all the models that endogenize technological change as the outcome of intentional profit-oriented R&D, but because for the purposes of the report, it is not interesting to know where technological change comes from because we're interested in its impact on labor markets. So we are largely silent on that because it is not the focus of the report.
Just to say, as an example of international economic cooperation, there is now a multilateral process underway to discuss taxation of the digital economy precisely because of the concerns about this and to try and find a sustainable multilateral solution to how you deal with these new business models and taxation.
Okay, one final one.
Sorry, very quickly, and thank you very much for organizing this. Given that you have two different forces at play here, trade and technology, is there anything you have discovered about the nature of those losers? Are they the same? Are they different? You would expect automation or technology to impact lower skilled workers more, or people who do more routine tasks. Trade effects could theoretically go across the board. Do you know anything about whether they're different?
We know that automation is especially bad for people performing routine tasks. We presume it is the same for trade, but our knowledge of theoretical knowledge about this is a little bit less advanced. This is my take. I don't know if Roberta has.
Very minimally, in the sense that to a certain extent, the difference could be that on trade, what you mainly outsource are things that can be outsourced, and so delegated far away, and maybe automation are not, the two things are not exactly the same, but to a large extent overlap for the moment. So those tasks you manage to offshore are also those tasks you manage to automate. The big issue is that there is really the sort of information, this level of detail is very, very limited. There was a presentation, I think, we had in the public lectures here by Mark Mundler that tried to look into these tasks, but it's really, at the moment, we don't know much to be able to distinguish between these two.